According to our modeling, we really see a crossover. If you are investing close to 2030, then it might be smarter to go for a longer duration battery. But really what we're seeing now, and that's also what the market confirms, is people who are investing now, who are looking to go online quite quickly within the next year or two, are going for a 1 or 2 hour battery.
Hello and welcome to Energy Unplugged by Aurora. This podcast features various experts from Aurora having in-depth conversations with key industry leaders, policymakers and academics from all over the world. It explores the hottest topics across the energy market and gives a unique perspective on major energy issues.
Welcome to Energy Unplugged. I'm Hans Koenig, Aurora's Managing Director for Central Europe. And today I'm joined by two of my colleagues, whom I'll introduce in a moment, to discuss battery business cases in Europe, which are becoming an increasingly hot topic across the continent, really, even by regulatory reforms, but of course also by the extreme volatility we've seen through very high fossil commodity prices over the past year or so. So joining me today to discuss business cases are Ryan Alexander. Ryan leads our European research team, which basically does pan-European power market analysis. And one of their really impactful and very popular reports this year has been the European Battery Markets Attractiveness report, which, as you might have guessed from the name, looks into what market and policy drivers there are in shaping the attractiveness of various markets for batteries across Europe. Hi, Ryan.
Hello.
My second guest on the show today is Marise Westbroek. Marise is a project leader in our advisory team, specializing in flexibility markets. Over the past year, she's led a really massive multi-client study investing battery business cases in Germany, Netherlands, and Belgium in particular. And after the conclusion of that study, she's been working with numerous battery developers, investors, and financiers in making projects happen in these three markets. So it's really great to have Marise on the show. Welcome, Marise.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Let's start with a broad outlook. Ryan, what are the current market conditions for batteries like? And maybe as a second question, how has the market been affected by supply chain constraints and in general also the craziness in power prices across Europe?
Sure. Thanks, Hans. So look, we all know in energy markets, it's been a wild ride this year. And for battery developers or owners, it's no exception, right? And actually, the wild ride they've been experiencing even predates what's happened this year. So on the cost side of things, we've seen massive cost inflation in components for batteries, lithium, which represents 33% of the raw material of batteries by weight. And the price of lithium has surged over 400% since the beginning of 2021. So, I mean, that is astounding. And, that's a function in part of the global supply chain crunch that we saw coming out of the coronavirus pandemic. But it's also because there's just massive investment in and increasing demand for electric vehicles. And so that price surge is unprecedented. And that's flowing through to the cost of utility scale batteries. And so from a developer's perspective, they've seen increases in CapEx for batteries of at least 25% compared to prior year. And this is quite a surprise because in the renewables space, we're all used to the price coming down over time. And this is quite a big bump we're seeing in the road. Now, when it comes to the revenue side of things, the Russian invasion of Ukraine precipitated this massive increase in gas prices and in turn power prices. And so on the renewable side of things, it actually has looked quite a lot better for batteries because they're seeing that flow through to their margins, and that is to some degree offsetting the cost side of things. So it is quite a wild ride out there.
To boil this down to a more simple statement than even what you said, if you're someone who built a battery a year ago at the capex we saw a year ago and ran it for the past year is a very happy person. Someone who's trying to develop a battery now might be less so because yes, they have the revenue opportunity, but at the same time they're facing much higher costs than they would have a year ago.
Absolutely. If you built a battery in the past few years prior to this cost increase, you really avoided this massive inflation that you saw in the past 18 or so months.
Okay, great. So digging into developers a little bit and who's active there. What characteristics do you think developers need these days to be successful in this very complex market?
Sure, and you said it's a complex market, and certainly I would say, and we've all within Aurora, many of us been in discussions with developers and at different stages of the life cycle of projects. What is clear is that developers build up experience over time. It's not unlike any other sector, and so we've seen that there are some ways where developers who have more experience and more track record, they learn lessons and they can apply that to future projects. So that could be in terms of managing costs, developing good relationships with their suppliers, which allow them to maybe anticipate or at least somehow mitigate the kinds of cost increases they might otherwise face. It also is very much evident in terms of developers and how they interact with optimizers or the parties that take their asset to market and optimize their revenues, because optimization of revenues is the key way by which developers can really squeeze as much out of those assets as possible. And so those that have engaged and have a good relationship with those optimizers or are more actively engaged themselves in trading strategies are the ones who can take that learning elsewhere. And I think a key part of that is also how to manage the batteries in the context of the warranties that the manufacturers provide to developers, because there are some pretty strict criteria that asset owners need to meet to make sure they don't blow through their warranty, and when something goes wrong, they're not able to cash in on that. And so having more experience being able to manage the state of charge and cycling of the assets means that developers can mitigate that risk. So I'd say, in mature markets like the UK, like Ireland, like Australia, developers have built up a track record in those markets. And what we've observed and what I've observed in the past months with the release of our report is that we see a lot of interest from developers who've learned their lessons in those markets, who have set themselves up and are taking those lessons and now looking to other markets and seeing where to go next. And that's certainly a pronounced trend right now.
Where are these players going? So what in your view are the most attractive markets right now? And perhaps what are the maybe underappreciated ones that might be next on everyone's agenda?
Sure. Well, Hans, we can't give it all away on the podcast, right? But at least we can provide some clues and some insights. What I might do is, just let's take an example of a mature market. So I've already mentioned the UK, but it's the obvious one, right? So the UK, it has now seen 2 gigawatts or just over 2 gigawatts of installations of grid scale batteries to date. This is over 3 times as much as any other European market. So they're miles ahead in this race, so to speak. Now, a lot of the revenues that you saw as a developer or an asset owner in the UK came from early trials that the grid, but the TSO and the regulators run in terms of new frequency products like enhanced frequency response. And what you see now is quite a shift, because there's almost a new generation of frequency products and services that have emerged over the past 12 or so months in the UK, in Great Britain, where battery developers can generate additional revenues. So the whole dynamic suite of products. So this is quite a mature market in that sense. They've already gone through a generation of frequency products, and they're going on to the next one. And this is not to mention the fact that they also have a capacity mechanism in the UK, which provides additional revenues for battery developers and owners. So that's a mature market. Now, if we take the example of a hot market or one where there's a lot of interest and it's kind of up and coming, absolutely Iberia is a good example of that. So Spain and Portugal to slightly different degrees. Now, they have relatively little battery capacity installed right now, so only in the order of a few hundred megawatts. But it's accelerating rapidly, and by our numbers, it's looking to be the 3rd biggest market in Europe by 2030. So a lot of growth in that space. Now, in Iberia, there is no capacity market, so it's a bit different there. And also, there is no primary reserve service, which is typically the kind of product that a battery would generate revenues from. Having said that, there are other frequency and balancing type services that generate revenues for batteries there. The interesting thing about Iberia too is that Iberia has become quite infamous in some ways for a co-location business model. So combining a solar asset in particular with a battery asset. And there's several advantages to that. One of those is that that you can create cost savings from being able to use a single grid connection point, for example, use a single inverter rather than two for the different assets. And this is also kind of supercharging the business case for batteries in Iberia. Now, if we take an example of an emerging market, so I would pick Poland. So Poland's market, at least in terms of ancillary or frequency services, is historically not liberalized. So you can't access those and get remunerated for those separately to other revenue streams. And there's been long planned reforms to open that up, basically, and that would be a huge game changer for batteries. Now that's due to launch in 2023, so next year. And Poland will be the 6th biggest market for renewables in Europe in 2030. So it's going to be a very deep market. So while the conditions aren't there right now, everything suggests that it's one to get into in the coming years.
I was hoping you'd mention Poland because actually we're kicking off a multi-client study on batteries in Poland over the next couple of weeks. So if you're looking into that, do get in touch. I'd like to zoom into Germany, the Netherlands, and Belgium now, though, and turn to Marise. Can you tell us how we see the revenue streams developing in these markets and what that means for trading strategies of batteries?
So let's maybe take one step back and look at the revenue streams that are available to batteries in these markets. So batteries can, of course, participate on the wholesale market, so day ahead and intraday, but they can also go on the frequency containment reserve or FCR and automated frequency restoration reserve or AFRR. In Belgium, in addition, there is also a capacity remuneration mechanism, and then there are some subsidy schemes in place and congestion alleviation mechanisms. But to come to your question about revenue streams, one phenomenon that we are observing now is that it is quite attractive to participate in a capacity-based remuneration. So, for example, the frequency containment reserve or the capacity side of the AFRR. And Ryan touched upon it. Of course, commodity prices are very high right now. So especially if you're in the FCR and some gas speaker is setting the price, then that has a very positive effect on your business case. Now, what we expect over time is that more batteries will come online and some of these revenues will be cannibalized away. So two drivers, commodity prices will hopefully re-equilibrate sometime, hopefully even before 2030, and there will be more storage units coming online, and that will bring these prices down. And that means that focus will really shift away from a capacity-based remuneration to arbitrage, which is trading on the day-ahead and intraday markets. And Ryan already touched on optimizers. There's a lot that you can do in these markets. I mean, you can do physical trading, but you can also do financial trading where, for example, you make your day-ahead commitment, you decide to buy that power back on the intraday market, or you can even do both. So we're seeing arbitrage as a major revenue stream going forward.
Great. Could you deep dive a little bit on how we actually model that in an integrated manner? Because all these markets exist, and the traditional battery business case, at least in Germany, that's how the first couple hundred megawatts were built, was really do frequency containment reserve 95% of the time, and then maybe something else some of the rest of the time. But it was really quite simple compared to the quite complex optimization between day ahead, intraday balancing, which is AFRR, containment reserve, and these kind of things.
Yeah, of course. Always love to talk about our model. So indeed, life is becoming more complicated for batteries. And the point that you made about the FCR market, I thought that was amusing because it is a view that I did hear from some lenders, but people are moving away from that view and accepting increasingly that you need exposure to all markets. So what we did is, first of all, we forecast the prices in these markets separately. So of course, we have a very good fundamental, highly granular model of the day-ahead market, and in many cases, the merit order that is built in the other markets comprises more or less the same participants. I mean, it depends. And people bid into these markets based on their opportunity costs. So what they could have made through quote unquote simple day ahead market participation. So that in itself is a beautiful thing, that we can forecast these prices under different scenarios and all their volatility. But then there is even an addition to that. What we then do is we say, okay, look, we've got a battery here, small battery, doesn't impact the market, and it's now going to design its trading strategy based on what it sees in these markets. So it sees these capacity-based markets and day-ahead markets 24 hours in advance, and then it sees price spreads in the intraday and AFR energy markets a little bit closer to the time. And it makes its decisions based on that information that it gets. And really one takeaway that we see from that modeling is that I would really recommend exposure to all markets, because that's very important to the business case.
I think the key punchlines here are imperfect foresight and the kind of the sequential accessing of markets, because you can't do it all at the same time. You need to optimize step by step, and that's something you and the team have spent quite a bit of time thinking about. We've already spoken about capex a fair amount, so maybe to take that one bit further and talk about duration, because lithium has become more expensive. In particular, longer duration batteries have become relatively more expensive than shorter duration batteries over the past year. So where do we see the duration game ending up right now? What is best right now, and how is that going to change?
So from a revenue perspective, the longer your duration, the better. The more possibilities you have to bid into longer duration capacity-based markets, and the better the spreads that you can capture as well. Ryan touched upon the cost side of batteries, and in particular lithium. So the decline in capex that Ryan alluded to, that's going to be most visible for longer duration batteries. So 4-hour batteries, for example. Our view is that the capex will come down by roughly half, even a little bit more, within the next decade or so. So according to our modeling, we really see a crossover. If you are investing close to 2030, then it might be smarter to go for a longer duration battery. But really what we're seeing now, and that's also what the market confirms, is people who are investing now, who are looking to go online quite quickly within the next year or two, are going for a 1 or 2 hour battery.
And so longer duration is 4 hours in output. So what?
Yeah, indeed.
Okay. So yeah, the lower capex gets, all else equal, it'll be more sensible to go for longer durations. Let's talk about individual and co-located business cases a little bit, because you can, to those of you less familiar with battery development, there's various places in the grid where you can put a battery. You can connect it individually, you can connect it co-located with a renewables resource. So usually this is a solar park in Europe, but there's some co-located with wind parks as well. You can even put it behind the meter, which we're kind of bracketing here. Between those two, kind of the isolated and the co-located ones, where do you see the pros and cons, and how does the co-location decision affect the business case?
Well, I would say it depends on the market. So we've had a couple of very good roundtable discussions on co-location, and in the Netherlands, the grid fee aspect alone makes it quite attractive to go for a co-located model. In Germany, if you look at a standalone versus co-located battery on a merchant basis, we see that The co-located case is a little bit better because, as Ryan said, the source of power is comparatively cheap. But it's also very interesting to look at the source of income. So if you're looking at the co-located asset, then a lot of the income actually comes through the solar capture price, whereas a standalone battery has to earn all its revenues on flexibility markets. So it's quite a different model.
What impact does this have on financing conditions for batteries, this kind of hybridization?
Yeah, that was a very interesting piece of feedback from the market. So far, these co-located assets have mainly been financed based on the revenues from the solar asset. And people are still, I would say, somewhat reluctant to invest in standalone batteries, but there is growing consensus that they are investable, and there's a growing push to add these storage assets. So I think you're on the safer side with a co-located asset when it comes to financing. On the other hand, that is changing. And what we see in both cases is that if you expose yourself to all flexibility markets, that is also viewed as a hedge.
Exactly, and the intuition here is if we move into a world where the solar assets revenues get strongly cannibalized, that is probably a world in which the storage asset is likely to be quite valuable, right? So this is really like a physical hedge that's inherent in that portfolio configuration, which is getting increasing attention, I think. Ryan, talking about cannibalization, can you talk to us a little bit about how we see that playing out and how big the risk for battery developers really is?
Sure. Well, Marise already mentioned that this is being observed in some markets, right? And when we look across the board, I mean, it's inevitable, right? The merit order, as Marise said, it's changing as you have more batteries entering these markets, or a given market rather. Then you will find that the merit order, but the stack of available capacity to provide these services shifts. And then you have a lot of assets that can provide frequency or balancing type services at relatively quite low cost compared to the clunky old thermal generators that have been doing it for the system for the past, however many decades. And I think there is a bit of a sweet spot at the moment, because if you are a first mover in a market as a battery developer, you can kind of access the prices that the thermal generators set for your frequency services, which tend to be quite high, but you are ahead enough of a competition that you're not getting you're not seeing the market saturated. But as each market goes through this process of transition, then it is a fact of the fundamentals that prices will come down substantially for basically every kind of frequency or frequency-like service. So that's not to say that that's a game that's going to kill the battery business case in markets. That's not at all what's going to happen. I mean, what we will see, and what we do see, is when we look at the IRRs in different markets, yes, you can get some stratospheric IRRs, pushing 20% in some markets because you are a first mover, but those markets tend to be quite shallow and really, in the longer term, having these more depressed prices still provides and still can provide an attractive and commercial IRR. What it does do, though, is it puts the challenge back to developers to optimize their assets and try and stack those revenues from multiple revenue streams. That is what's going to kind of give you those incremental increases in IRR to generate a better business case.
And especially from a debt financing side as well. So even 4 or 5 years ago, we were involved in project financings for batteries in Germany, the Netherlands, on an FCR forecast purely, a single market, and that was considered bankable by banks. But nowadays, with these markets increasingly saturated, I think the approach is much more to look at the portfolio of markets available to you, and the deeper markets such as optimization between day ahead and intraday, financial trading as well as physical trading and so forth. And I think that's where a lot of the magic lies to defend yourself against this cannibalization in the smaller markets.
I think it's important not to be sensationalist about it, right? Because in terms of EV uptake, markets will move at different speeds. It certainly hasn't been something to watch for batteries that are coming into commercial operation in recent years. But we'll just see the risk growing as the penetration of EVs grows in different markets. And it's very much a product of regulation and innovation in those markets, because not every market is going to allow these kinds of aggregation kind of business models to emerge the same way as some of the more opportunistic or innovative markets in Northwestern Europe are.
To talk about another risk, I mean, we should be talking about the positive things more than the negative things. But one key risk I do see, and that often comes up in my client conversations, is the risk of cannibalization from other sources of flexibility that don't need to earn back their capex in the markets in which they're active. What do we mean by that? 2 examples: vehicles that are aggregated to provide things like frequency control or even that trade in the power markets, or the home storages, so the Tesla power walls of this world. Again, most of Europe, they're sitting pretty much unused in wind. So again, they can contribute to the same markets in which utility scale batteries play, without having to earn back their capex, because that's already been paid for by their owners. So how do we see that? Is that a real risk?
It's a great question. I think it's a really interesting question, because we don't know, right? Because we're in a once in a generation transition here, and so who knows how things play out. But when you do the numbers, I mean, it's pretty clear that this is a risk. If we just take home storage for an example, it's huge in Germany, in Belgium, and to a lesser degree Poland. And so that's for local factors. It's because the economics make sense at the household level, and also the availability of subsidies, etc. So in those markets, the total volume of storage there is already larger than what you see in grid scale storage. So just on the numbers alone, if you can get an aggregation business model together, and there are a bunch of those kinds of players out there in some of those markets that can take those assets and bid into any of the frequency markets or balancing markets, then you've already seen a doubling of the potential competition from the perspective of a grid scale battery. Now, what is really interesting is the EV story, because across Europe at the moment, we've got around about 40 gigawatts or so of grid scale and home scale batteries. So by 2030, so this is our projection. And that's, if you kind of just assume a duration there, that might translate to 150 gigawatt hours of storage. Now, we will have by 2030, based on our projections, over 2,000 gigawatt hours of storage in electric vehicles. So we're talking about 20 times as much. It's wild. Now, I don't think all of that, actually, most of that is going to be bidirectional enabled electric vehicles. No one wants to go into their garage to drive to the shops and realize that the battery's flat because they, let their power retailer do something funny with it overnight, right? So it's not going to be like that. But if only 5% of those EVs are bidirectional, then bidirectional chargers, so they can discharge from the grid and discharge back to the grid, then that's going to achieve the same total volume as grid scale batteries. So that is quite a lot. And the other thing, the last point I would add is that a lot of these EVs will be smart charging EVs. So they will charge from the grid when the price is low. So that is a huge amount of storage coming onto the market, which is going to compete with utility batteries who are also providing that service. So the risk is not symmetrical in that sense. Frequency products that go in the same direction as electric vehicles, so i.e. those that can charge from the grid, so they're bringing the frequency down, are going to saturate faster than the products that are doing the opposite service.
Very interesting. Thanks, Ryan. And I think definitely agree with your assessment there. I think if listeners are wondering to what extent this is a problem for business cases now, I guess the question is how fast are these markets for EVs, for home storages, really ramping up to be material, right? Because yes, these are dominating in Norway, but there's still fairly small percentages of the existing stocks of cars in pretty much all of Europe. So if you're investing in a battery now, chances are the asset is actually getting towards the end of its lifetime by the time even the EV market, for instance, gets to the required scale to have it to leave a serious mark there. So I think that's the other nuance I would add. The last cluster of topics I'd like to discuss with the two of you is around regulation and market design, because our European listeners will know this. There's a huge amount of momentum in terms of regulatory reform in Europe right now. Partly it's been going on for a couple of years, kind of the liberalization of the services, balancing markets, and so forth. But partly it's a response to the energy crisis when prices go through the roof and security of supply is in danger. Politicians get nervous and decisions are made. So to start with the longer term developments, Ryan, what are the main regulatory developments we should be watching out for in Europe?
There's always regulatory developments, right? It's a market which is very much driven by regulation. So if we just start at the macro level, various markets have specific targets enshrined in policy or law for the amount of storage that they want to see deployed. A good example of that is Italy, where their national energy and climate plan targets 3 gigawatts of batteries by 2030. And so this kind of clarity is very helpful for developers and investors, and not every market is like that. Germany, for example, does not yet have a quantitative a target like that, just to provide a contrast. And in Italy, it's actually another example of a market where ancillary services that batteries generate revenues from are actually not really available to batteries right now, save for a pilot that was done in the past couple of years. But it's quite clear, and the government, the TSO, the market operator has made it clear that market will become available to batteries, and that's happening in the course of next year. So it's in that way not too dissimilar to Poland, as we were talking about before. And once that market opens, then the potential for batteries will be unlocked. Another example of what's important to watch is in Ireland. So Ireland has had a pretty comprehensive suite of frequency products, the DS3 suite of frequency and balancing type products available to batteries for many years. And some of those services have been priced on a regulated basis. So it's the regulator setting the prices. Now, over the coming years, the expectation and the signals are that will change. And what that means is you're going to see a more competitive environment for pricing of some of those services in Ireland, which will bring prices down. Doesn't kill the business case, but it certainly is an important thing to watch. And then another thing I would add, and the final thing I would add, is on the kind of pan-European level, there's been a big shift, or a big shift towards harmonization of the way different countries balance their grids. So this has very much been a national competency for a long time, but there's also been a big push to harmonize this across Europe and try and realize the gains you get from making generators in one market able to provide these services to another market across the border. And so for those in the business, these platforms are called Picasso and Mari. They're acronyms. And at least, for example, with Picasso, that one went live in July this year for selected European markets. And we're already seeing that have some impacts, modest impacts, but positive impacts in terms of reducing costs for everyone. It also means, in some ways, it simplifies things for a developer or an asset owner. So in Germany, for example, and Marise can probably certainly speak to this more than I can, the AFRR product is changed from a 4-hour product at least in terms of the bidding structure, to a 15-minute product, which makes things much more flexible. So this is a good example of the quite micro changes, but quite potentially impactful changes that are taking place that are relevant for batteries.
Okay, thanks, Ryan. Let's now turn to the more immediate market design and regulatory responses to the energy crisis we have at hand in Europe. And a wide variety of things are being discussed or implemented there. So what we already have is a revenue cap on certain generators, which you can tell us more about this in a second, Marise, but understand does not affect batteries. However, there's also further measures under discussion. For instance, subsidizing fossil generators, as is already being done on the Iberian Peninsula, or even splitting the market in some way between low and high marginal cost generators, as the Greek government has proposed, and that could affect batteries. So how do we see all that playing out, Marise?
Oh, I think you're better off asking Ryan about Iberia. But no, let's turn to the topic on everybody's mind. So the energy crisis and its impact on batteries. So the good news is that the European Council excluded storage from these revenue caps. So by and large, what that means is batteries are, of course, affected by the energy crisis because commodity prices indirectly still set the price in many markets, but they are not subject to the regulatory impact, which would have meant that they would have had to give back part of their revenues. And then when it comes to the markets that I've mostly looked at, so that's the Netherlands, Germany, and Belgium, of course, they are subject to this European regulation and all these phenomena that Ryan mentioned. Picasso is a big one, although it's not live in the Netherlands yet. But let me just highlight one regulatory thing to watch for each of these markets. So in the Netherlands, of course, grid fees are very big. Grid fees are a showstopper in most of the scenarios that we model. And the bad news is that for users of the high voltage grid, grid fees will go up by just over 50% in 2023 compared to 2022 levels. We are hearing things on the grapevine that there is some movement towards changing the grid fees in the Netherlands, but there's no official announcement on that yet. In Germany, there is still the ever-present discussion about a capacity market that might be introduced. There is already a capacity remuneration mechanism in Belgium, which we've seen in our modeling, despite the derating factors, is quite an attractive extra revenue stream. So just to give you an idea of the order of magnitude, the revenues that you realize with a 2-hour battery, if you go live in 2025, let's say, are of the same order of magnitude as what you realize in our model through trading on the intraday market. So quite an attractive upside already in place in Belgium and potentially to come in Germany.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Marise. Thank you very much, Ryan. I would conclude the conversation on that note. And thank you very much for joining. I thank our listeners for listening in, and just encourage you to contact any of us or any of our colleagues if you're looking into building or investing in or financing battery assets in any European markets, particularly in Poland or Greece, because these are the two next markets we're adding to our portfolio of markets where we are doing very detailed modeling of the revenue stacks available to batteries. Thank you for listening in, and goodbye.
That was Hans Koenig, Aurora's Managing Director for Central Europe, talking to Marise Westbroek, Project Leader at Aurora, and Ryan Alexander, Research Lead at Aurora. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to subscribe on whatever platform you use. Thanks for listening, and goodbye.